Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we're diving into a story that might hit closer to home for some of you than you'd expect. Have you ever felt like everything you worked for your entire life, your family, your home, was suddenly ripped away without any warning? Imagine being forced to leave the place where you built your life, where your memories live in every corner. You might think you can handle it. You think you've prepared for the worst. But the truth is sometimes the hardest thing to face is the betrayal that comes from the people you love most. Tonight, I'm going to share my journey with you. A journey of loss, betrayal, and finding strength when I thought there was none left. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy what I'm doing here, of course. I'd love to hear where you're watching from tonight, so drop a comment with your city and let's see just how far my story is reaching. Now let's dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some soothing background noise, and let's begin this journey together. The dining room felt different without Harold's presence. The mahogany table that had hosted countless family dinners now seemed too large, too empty, despite the three of us sitting around it. I kept glancing at his empty chair, expecting to see him there, with his gentle smile and calming presence. It had been exactly 1 week since we buried my husband of 32 years. 1 week since I'd stood at his graveside, feeling like half of my soul had been ripped away. The grief still sat heavy in my chest, making every breath feel labored. "Pass the potatoes, Candace," my daughter-in-law said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Candace had never used a warm tone with me. But tonight, there was something different, something colder. I reached for the serving bowl, my hand still trembling slightly. The funeral had drained me more than I'd expected. At 71, I thought I had prepared myself for this day. But nothing could have prepared me for the hollow ache that followed me everywhere now. Jonathan, my 43-year-old son, sat between us like a referee who'd already chosen sides. He'd barely looked at me all evening. His attention focused entirely on his wife of 15 years. The son who used to crawl into my lap when he had nightmares now couldn't even meet my eyes. "The service was beautiful, wasn't it?" I offered, trying to fill the uncomfortable silence. "Your father would have loved seeing so many people there." Candace set down her fork with deliberate precision. "Yes, well, that's actually what we need to discuss with you, Myrtle." Something in her tone made my stomach clench. I looked between her and Jonathan, searching for any sign of the warmth that should exist between family members who'd just shared a loss. Instead, I found cold calculation in Candace's eyes and uncomfortable avoidance in my son's. "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. Candace straightened in her chair, assuming the posture she used when delivering ultimatums. I had seen it before, usually when she was explaining why Jonathan couldn't visit me as often, or why family traditions needed to be altered to accommodate her preferences. "Jonathan and I have been talking," she began, her voice taking on that false sweetness she used when she wanted something. "Now that Harold is gone, this house is going to be too much for you to handle alone." I blinked, confused. "Too much? I've been managing this house for over 30 years. I know every creaky floorboard and temperamental faucet." "Yes, that's exactly the problem." Candace continued, her mask of pleasantness slipping slightly. "You're not getting any younger, and maintaining a house this size is expensive. Jonathan and I think it would be best if you moved somewhere more suitable." The words hit me like a physical blow. Moved. This is my home. Harold and I built our life here. Jonathan had grown up here. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice barely above a mumble. "Mom, Candace is right. The upkeep alone is going to be overwhelming for you." "I'm not helpless, Jonathan," I said, hearing my voice crack slightly. "And this house? Your father and I Saved for years to buy this place. Every room holds memories of our life together. Candace's expression hardened. Memories don't pay utility bills or property taxes. Be practical, Myrtle. I stared at her, this woman who had systematically pushed me out of my son's life for 15 years. The woman who had convinced Jonathan that Sunday dinners with his mother were too much pressure, and that holiday visits needed to be balanced between families, which somehow always meant more time with her relatives. What exactly are you suggesting? I asked, though I could feel the answer forming like ice in my stomach. We think you should look into one of those nice senior communities, Candace said, her tone suggesting she was doing me a tremendous favor. Somewhere with activities and people your own age. It would be so much better for you than rattling around in this big, empty house. I turned to Jonathan, desperately hoping to see some sign that he disagreed with this plan. Jonathan, you really think I should sell the house where you grew up, where your father and I... It makes sense, Mom, he interrupted, still not meeting my eyes. And honestly, Candace and I could use the space. We've been talking about expanding our family, and this house has so much potential. The meaning behind his words crashed over me like a cold wave. They didn't just want me gone, they wanted my house. The home Harold and I had lovingly restored room by room over 3 decades. Now that the sorrows died down, live your grief, pack your bags, and never come back. Candace's voice suddenly lost all pretense of civility. The house was never really yours anyway. I felt my world tilt on its axis. Just living here, as if 32 years of marriage, of building a life and raising a family, amounted to nothing more than extended house sitting. I see, I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. Inside, something was breaking apart. Not just my heart, but my understanding of who my son was, who my family was. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady. I'll need some time. 2 weeks. Candace cut me off. That should be plenty of time to find somewhere suitable and arrange for movers. 2 weeks? Not 2 months. Not even a reasonable timeline to grieve and plan. 2 weeks to dismantle a lifetime. Jonathan finally looked directly at me, and what I saw there was worse than anger or hatred. It was indifference. Complete casual indifference to my pain. It's for the best, Mom, he said, as if he were convincing himself as much as me. You'll see. I walked upstairs to the bedroom I'd shared with Harold. Each step felt like I was climbing a mountain. The room still smelled like his cologne, and his reading glasses were still on the nightstand where he'd left them the night before his heart attack. I sat on the edge of our bed and stared at my reflection in the dresser mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed older than 71, her silver hair limp and her blue eyes dulled by shock and grief. In 2 weeks, I would have to leave this room where I'd said goodbye to Harold just 7 days ago. I would have to pack up 32 years of marriage into boxes and surrender it all to a son who just told me I'd never really belonged here anyway. But as I sat there in the gathering darkness, something else began to stir beneath the grief and shock. A small, hard kernel of determination. Harold had always been the one who handled our finances, but he taught me to be thorough, to pay attention to details. Tomorrow, I would start making arrangements. I would call the bank and begin the process of figuring out exactly what I was entitled to. Because if Jonathan and Candace thought they could just erase me from this family without consequence, they might be in for a surprise. The morning sun felt different streaming through the kitchen windows as I sat alone at the breakfast table nursing my second cup of coffee. 10 days had passed since that awful dinner, and the house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to leave. Jonathan and Candace had already been by twice to assess the space measuring rooms and discussing renovations as if I were invisible. Yesterday, I'd overheard Candace on the phone with a contractor scheduling estimates for once the old woman moves out. I had spent those 10 days in a strange bubble of numbness, mechanically sorting through belongings and trying to ignore the growing knot of anxiety in my stomach. But this morning I finally felt ready to face the practical matters Harold would have expected me to handle. I would start by calling the bank to figure out exactly what was going on with our finances. Harold had always kept things close to the chest, but I was about to find out just how much he'd prepared for this moment. The drive to First National Bank took 15 minutes through the familiar streets of our neighborhood. I'd been making this same drive for over 20 years, usually with Harold in the passenger seat, handling our banking business while I waited in the car. He'd always been protective of our finances, not because he didn't trust me, but because he said it was one less thing for me to worry about. Now I wished I had paid more attention. Mrs. Patterson, the bank manager, greeted me with the careful sympathy reserved for recent widows. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm so sorry to hear about Harold. He was such a gentleman, always asking about my grandchildren." "Thank you, Helen. He spoke fondly of you, too." I settled into the chair across from her desk, my purse clutched tightly in my lap. "I need to understand our financial situation. Harold handled everything, and I'm afraid I'm rather lost." Helen's expression softened with understanding. "Of course, let me pull up your accounts." She turned to her computer, fingers clicking across the keyboard. After a moment, her eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh my, is something wrong?" My heart jumped. Had Jonathan and Candace somehow already gained access to our accounts? "Not wrong exactly. It's just there are quite a few accounts here, more than I was expecting," Helen said, her voice holding a note of surprise. "Let me start with the joint checking account you and Harold used for household expenses." She printed out a statement and slid it across the desk. The balance was modest, but comfortable enough to cover my expenses for several months if I was careful. Relief flooded through me. At least I wouldn't be destitute now, Helen continued. "There's also a savings account in both your names." Another sheet of paper appeared. This balance was significantly larger enough to sustain me for years if necessary. "That's wonderful," I said, feeling some of the tension leave my shoulders. Harold was always careful about saving. Yes, he was very methodical. Helen agreed, but she was still frowning at her screen. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm seeing several other accounts here that I need to verify. Some appear to be in your name only." "My name only?" I echoed, confused. "That doesn't sound right. Harold managed all our finances." Helen's fingers flew over the keyboard again. "According to our records, there are 4 additional accounts. 2 CDs, a money market account, and this is interesting, a trust account that was established 5 years ago." My head began to spin. "I don't understand. Harold never mentioned any of this to me." "May I ask, did your husband ever express concerns about your family situation?" Helen asked, clearly choosing her words carefully. "Protection from what?" I asked. "I'm not sure what you mean." Helen hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Sometimes when clients have complex family dynamics, perhaps concerns about inheritance disputes or external pressures, they take steps to ensure their spouse's financial security." I thought about Harold's behavior over the past few years, how he'd started asking pointed questions about Candace's spending habits, how he'd grown quiet whenever Jonathan mentioned their financial struggles, how he'd insisted on handling all our banking personally, never allowing Jonathan to accompany him even when our son offered. "Can you tell me about these other accounts?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Helen printed several more pages. "The first CD has been rolling over annually for 7 years. The second was opened 3 years ago. The money market account has been receiving automatic transfers from your joint checking account. Small amounts, $50 here and there, but over time." She handed me the statements. The numbers swam in front of my eyes. These weren't modest emergency funds. These were substantial amounts of money, enough to buy a house, enough to live comfortably for decades. "How is this possible?" I asked. "I never signed anything." "You did," Helen said, gently pulling out a file folder. "Your signatures are on all the paperwork. It appears Harold brought you in to sign documents, probably telling you they were routine banking updates or insurance forms." I stared at the paper she showed me. There was my signature dated and witnessed on forms I didn't remember signing. But looking at the dates, I could place some of them. The day we'd come in to update our address after the house numbers changed. The time we'd switched to a new type of checking account. He never told me what I was really signing, I whispered.
It's not uncommon, Helen said carefully. Some spouses prefer to handle the details to avoid causing stress or confusion, and legally everything is above board. These accounts are legitimately yours. I tried to process what this meant. While Jonathan and Candace were measuring my kitchen and planning their renovations while they were treating me like a burden to be disposed of, I had resources they knew nothing about.
There's one more thing, Helen said, her voice even more cautious now. The trust account I mentioned, it's been receiving transfers from a business account for the past 5 years. The Henderson Construction Trust. I believe that was your husband's company.
Yes, but Harold sold the business when he retired, I said. Jonathan said the money from the sale was barely enough to pay off debts.
Helen consulted her screen again. According to our records, the business account is still active. There have been regular deposits and then transfers to your trust account. I felt the blood drain from my face.
But Harold retired. He wasn't working anymore. Yes, but he maintained oversight and handled the larger strategic decisions. The actual construction work has been managed by Tom Bradley. I believe you know him.
I nodded.
Tom had worked for Harold for over 20 years, starting as a young apprentice and working his way up to foreman. He'd been at the funeral one of the few people there who'd seemed genuinely grief-stricken.
Tom has been essentially running the company for the past 5 years, Margaret continued.
Harold structured it so that Tom receives a percentage of the profits as a performance bonus, which has kept him motivated and loyal. It's been a very successful arrangement. I felt a sharp pang in my chest. Why didn't Harold tell me any of this? Helen hesitated. Mrs. Henderson, this might not be my place to say, but Harold was concerned about family pressures. He mentioned that Jonathan had been struggling financially and Candace had expensive tastes. Harold worried that if the family knew about the continued business income, there would be expectations and demands that might compromise your future security. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. Every time Jonathan had asked his father for a loan, every time Candace had made comments about how comfortable we seemed, Harold had been calculating how to help our son without sacrificing my future independence. He was protecting me. I said the words heavy with realization.
He was protecting both of you in different ways, Margaret said gently.
The loans he made to Jonathan over the years were substantial, but they came from the business operating account, not from my personal assets. He had been very careful to document everything properly. I opened the folder with shaking hands. These were copies of all the loan agreements between the business and Jonathan. Harold had insisted on treating them as formal business transactions with payment schedules and interest rates. I looked at the numbers. The amount staggering tens of thousands of dollars over the past 5 years, supposedly for Jonathan's various business ventures and investments. Has Jonathan been making payments on these loans? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Margaret's expression grew uncomfortable. The payment schedule shows significant arrears. As of last month, the outstanding balance with accumulated interest is approximately $87,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. Jonathan owed the family business, my business, nearly $90,000, while simultaneously claiming that Harold had left nothing behind.
What happens to these loan obligations now? I asked.
They transfer with the business assets. As the new owner of the trust, you have the legal right to demand payment or restructure the terms as you see fit. I thought about Jonathan and Candace measuring my kitchen, planning their renovations, discussing when they could start showing the house. They were so confident, so certain they deserved everything Harold had built. I smiled softly, a strange calmness washing over me. They had no idea. As I sat there looking at the documents that had been carefully prepared for me, I felt a quiet satisfaction settling over me. Jonathan and Candace had no idea what was waiting for them. They thought I was vulnerable, that I was just a grieving widow who would meekly accept whatever they chose for me. But I had the upper hand now, and it felt like a power I hadn't known I had. After leaving the bank, I drove straight to the lawyer's office. The next step was clear. I had to meet with Tom Bradley, the one person who could confirm what Harold had done, and who could help me with the final pieces of this puzzle. Tom's office was a small space above the town's hardware store, and when I entered, I was greeted by the smell of wood polish and a faint trace of old coffee. Tom was already sitting at his desk, his broad shoulders hunched as he sifted through a few papers. When he saw me, he rose quickly, his eyes filled with both surprise and a deep sense of responsibility. "Mrs. Henderson, I didn't expect you to come by so soon," he said, his gravelly voice warm but cautious. "How can I help?" "I need to understand everything," I replied, sitting down across from him. "What Harold did, why he made the decisions he did, and how I can make sure Jonathan and Candace don't tear apart what Harold built." Tom nodded understanding immediately. "I'll tell you everything you need to know," he said. "But you should know Mrs. Henderson. Harold had a very specific plan. He may have kept you in the dark about a lot of it, but he always meant to protect you, and he worked hard to make sure you would be all right no matter what happened." "I know," I said quietly, as the weight of Harold's love and foresight hit me all at once. I just didn't realize how much he had done. Tom pulled out a file and slid it across the table toward me. "This is everything. The company's financials, the structure of the trust, the terms of the loans, and all the arrangements Harold made to ensure the business could continue even without him." I opened the file, scanning the documents quickly. There were records of various loans and payments, but what caught my eye were the carefully constructed clauses regarding ownership and management. Harold had transferred everything to the trust, making sure I was listed as the primary beneficiary with full control over the assets. "These were all business transactions," Tom continued. "Your son Jonathan was never meant to take over without you being involved. Harold kept you as the legal beneficiary of the trust to make sure that when the time came, you could make the decisions that were best for you." I looked at the financial statements, noting that the company had been more profitable than I'd expected. There were large payments made to Jonathan over the years, but these were loans, not gifts, as Jonathan had always assumed. In fact, there were records showing that Jonathan had never paid back a single cent of these loans. The amount owed was staggering, well over $90,000. "How do I handle this?" I asked, feeling the reality of the situation beginning to sink in. "I'm not in a position to run a construction company, and I don't know if I want to take over Harold's business. But I also can't let Jonathan just walk away from this." Tom paused, his eyes flickering with sympathy. "You have a few options, Mrs. Henderson. You could continue with the business, and I'm confident that with my help, we could keep it running smoothly. Or you could liquidate the assets and use the funds to ensure you're financially secure. It's entirely up to you. But either way, Jonathan can't get away with what he's done." I knew Tom was right. Jonathan couldn't just waltz into the business and claim it as his own. There were debts, responsibilities, and promises Harold had made that needed to be fulfilled. But I also knew I couldn't continue running a company like Henderson Construction. It wasn't my world, and it never had been. I took a deep breath. I want to maintain the business, but I need to make sure Jonathan pays what he owes. I'll need to restructure things, make sure I'm legally protected, and make sure he's held accountable. Tom smiled. "I'll help you with that. We'll set up a payment plan for Jonathan to pay back the loan, and if he doesn't, we'll take legal action. I'll make sure everything is in writing, and we'll keep things professional. You don't have to worry about anything." I nodded, a sense of relief flooding through me. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was in control.
I wasn't going to let Jonathan and Candace take what was rightfully mine. Harold had worked hard to protect me, and now it was my turn to protect myself.
As we discussed the details of the plan, I could feel the weight of the last few days lifting off my shoulders. The grief was still there, raw and unrelenting, but now I had a sense of direction. I had a plan, and more importantly, I had the power to execute it. The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and paperwork. It felt as though my entire life had been turned upside down in an instant, and now, for the first time in years, I was being forced to take control. I found myself pushing through the pain of loss, fueled by a growing determination to protect what Harold had built for us. One thing I knew for certain, I wasn't going to let Jonathan and Candace walk all over me. They had underestimated me. They thought they could push me out of the house and business without facing any consequences. But they had no idea what I was capable of now. I spent the morning at the office with Tom reviewing the business contracts and documents that would help me take over the company legally. Tom's quiet support made all the difference. His experience with Henderson Construction and his loyalty to Harold were invaluable in helping me make sense of all the financial jargon. I also called in a lawyer to review the trust documents and make sure everything was in order. It was important to me that I knew exactly what I was entitled to before I made any moves. I had no intention of being taken by surprise again. I wouldn't make the same mistake I had with Jonathan. In the afternoon, I drove to a nearby coffee shop to clear my head. As I sat by the window sipping my coffee, I thought back to the conversation I'd had with Jonathan and Candace. I couldn't shake the image of them sitting at the dinner table, their eyes devoid of any empathy. The way Jonathan had brushed me off as if I were some inconvenient afterthought. The way Candace had looked at me, calculating cold. It made my blood run cold to think about how easily they had dismissed me. How they thought they could just move me out of my home without any regard for my feelings. They saw me as nothing more than a pawn in their game, something to be discarded once they no longer had use for me. But I wasn't a pawn, and I wasn't going to be discarded. As I looked out at the busy street, I knew that I had a choice. I could sit back and let Jonathan and Candace continue their plan, or I could fight for what was mine. And I chose to fight. That evening, I called Jonathan. My heart pounded in my chest as I dialed his number, but I forced myself to remain calm. I wasn't going to let him see me flinch.
"Jonathan," I said when he picked up, "we need to talk." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before he responded, his voice cool. "What about Mom? I thought we were done with this. You've had your time to grieve. Now it's time for you to move on." I clenched my jaw, refusing to let his words rattle me. "I haven't had time to grieve because you've been too busy planning how to sell the house and liquidate everything. But I'm not going anywhere, Jonathan, and neither is the business." There was silence on the other end for a moment, and then Jonathan laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was a laugh of disbelief, as though he couldn't fathom that I would stand up to him.
"You're not in a position to make demands, Mom," he said finally. "The house is already in the process of being sold. You've had your time, you're done." I could feel the anger rising inside me, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You've made a mistake, Jonathan. A big one. You think this is over, but it's just beginning." There was another pause, and this time I could hear the shift in his tone. He was beginning to realize that I wasn't backing down. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice more guarded now. "I've spoken to Tom. I've spoken to the lawyer. I know everything, Jonathan. You and Candace have no idea what's coming. You've been taking money from the company for years without paying it back. You owe the business nearly $100,000, and now I'm taking over." There was a brief silence before Jonathan spoke again, his voice now tinged with frustration. "You can't do that, Mom. You don't know anything about running a business. You'll just ruin it all." "I'm not running the business, Jonathan. But I will make sure you pay what you owe. And if you don't, the law will take care of it.
You'll regret treating me like I'm disposable.
I hung up the phone, feeling a rush of adrenaline. It was done. The first move had been made. Jonathan had no idea what I was capable of, and I was about to show him. Over the next few days, I continued to work with Tom and my lawyer, organizing the next steps for the company and finalizing the paperwork for the trust. I also started to make plans for the house. Jonathan and Candace had no idea how much money Harold had set aside for me, and they had no idea how much leverage I had now.
But as I sat down that evening, looking out at the sunset from my living room, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness. Jonathan was my son, and Candace, despite everything, was family. But they had crossed a line. They had taken advantage of me, and now they were going to learn the hard way that you don't mess with family.
The following week, I met with the bank and my lawyer again. We had a lot to work through: loans, documents, business transactions, but I felt like I was starting to understand it all. With each passing day, I grew more confident in my ability to take control of the situation. And then came the day when everything changed. The morning light streamed through the curtains, a soft glow that seemed to fill the room with hope. I had spent the night tossing and turning, my mind spinning with all the things I had yet to do. But today, something felt different. I could feel the weight of the situation shifting, and it gave me a strange sense of power. I had made the decision to act decisively, to take back what was rightfully mine. Jonathan and Candace had no idea what was coming their way. I had been patient long enough, and now I was ready to stand up for myself. The plan was simple but necessary. I was going to make them face the consequences of their actions. I had already made a few strategic moves, but today was the day I would take it further. The stakes were high, and I could feel the tension in the air as if everything were building to a climax. I decided to meet with the accountant, Margaret, to review everything I had learned so far. She had been an invaluable ally, especially after all the documents she had shared with me. The truth was becoming clearer with each passing day, and it made my blood run cold to think of how Jonathan had been living in such ignorance of the financial structure Harold had set up. But it wasn't just ignorance, it was a carefully crafted plan of deceit and manipulation. The drive to Margaret's office was brief, but heavy with anticipation. I replayed the conversations with Jonathan and Candace in my mind, remembering their dismissive attitudes and the way they had tried to push me out of my home. I refused to let them get away with it.
Mrs. Henderson. Margaret greeted me warmly when I arrived. I trust everything is going well.
As well as it can be, I replied, a wry smile tugging at my lips. But I'm about to make things a little more interesting. She raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by my tone. Interesting how I set the stack of papers down on the desk. Jonathan thinks he's in control. He thinks he can sell the house, claim the business, and push me out of my life. But he's wrong. I know everything now. Harold left me a strong foundation, and it's time to show Jonathan and Candace what that means. Margaret nodded, her expression serious. It's good to hear you're taking charge, but you have to be careful, Myrtle. This is going to get messy. I'm prepared for that, I said firmly. I've been living in the shadows for too long. Now it's time for them to realize that I'm not someone to be underestimated. We spent the next hour going over the financials, and I felt more and more empowered with each new revelation. The trust Harold had set up, the careful planning, and the way he had ensured my security, it was all coming together. The numbers were precise, and the business was thriving, despite Jonathan's claims of hardship. By the end of the meeting, I was ready. Margaret had pulled together all the necessary documentation, and with her help, I had everything I needed to make my move. I called Jonathan that afternoon. My heart pounded in my chest, but I knew this call was a necessary step. I couldn't afford to wait any longer. Jonathan, I said when he picked up, we need to talk, face to face. There was a long pause before he responded, his voice tinged with annoyance. What now, Mom? I thought we were done with this. No, Jonathan, I replied, my voice steady. We're not done, not by a long shot. I know what you've been up to, and I'm not going to let you take what's mine. You've made your move now, I'm making mine." He fell silent for a moment, and I could hear the tension building on the other end of the line. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice now cautious.
"You'll find out soon enough," I said, hanging up before he could respond.
I spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. The thought of confronting Jonathan and Candace filled me with a strange mix of dread and determination. I had always prided myself on being a loving mother, a loyal wife. But now I was being forced into a corner, and I wasn't going to let them take away the life Harold and I had built. That evening, Jonathan and Candace arrived at the house, their footsteps echoing through the empty hallway as they made their way to the living room. They were dressed in their usual airs of superiority, Candace's polished smile barely masking the condescension that had become her signature. Jonathan looked like a man who had convinced himself that he was in control, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes that made me smile inwardly. "You wanted to talk?" Jonathan said, his tone clipped as he looked around the room, clearly assessing the space as though it were already his. He had no idea how wrong he was. "Yes, Jonathan," I replied, my voice cool and collected. "It's time for you to understand that you're not in charge here. I am." I placed the stack of documents on the coffee table between us. Jonathan and Candace both looked at them, their faces shifting from smug confidence to confusion. "These are the trust documents, Jonathan," I said, meeting his gaze. "The business, the house, it's all mine. I'm the sole beneficiary. Harold made sure that no matter what happened, I would be taken care of." "What are you talking about?" Jonathan sputtered, his voice rising in disbelief. This is impossible." "Is it?" I asked, letting the silence stretch out between us. "Harold set this all up years ago. He knew what was coming. He knew what kind of people you were becoming. And he made sure that I'd never be left without a roof over my head or a means to support myself." I could see the shock on Jonathan's face as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Candace, ever the strategist, was already calculating her next move. But I could tell from the way she clenched her jaw that she too was starting to realize just how much she had underestimated me. This isn't right," Jonathan said, his voice trembling with frustration. "You can't just take everything. This house, it's our family's legacy." "I'm not taking anything, Jonathan," I said quietly. "I'm taking back what's rightfully mine. And you, Candace, you're not going to get away with trying to throw me out of my own home. This isn't just about money, it's about respect." The room fell silent, and for the first time since Jonathan and Candace had arrived, I felt a surge of satisfaction. This was my moment. This was the day everything changed. I watched Jonathan and Candace as their expressions morphed from confusion to anger, and then to something I hadn't expected, fear. Fear that they were losing control. Fear that I, the woman they had tried to dismiss as weak, was now holding all the cards. Candace recovered first, her eyes narrowing as she met mine. "You really think this is going to work, Myrtle?" Her voice dripped with scorn. "You've been living in denial for far too long. This house, this business, none of it belongs to you. Harold made sure it stayed in the family." I almost laughed. This wasn't the same woman I had once welcomed into my home. This was a woman who had manipulated my son and tried to run my life for years, but now I was finally seeing her for who she truly was. "Harold made sure it stayed in the family, yes," I said slowly, each word sinking into the silence. "But it's my family now, Candace. Not yours. You don't get to decide what belongs to me, not anymore." Jonathan shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Candace, who had grown increasingly tense beside him. He cleared his throat and spoke, but there was no confidence in his voice. "This is all very unexpected, Mom, but you're still grieving. Maybe you're not in the right frame of mind to understand the full picture." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, looking directly into his eyes. The full picture, Jonathan, is that I've spent my entire life supporting this family. I raised you, I loved you, and I trusted you. But now, after everything Harold did to protect me, I'm going to show you just how much I can handle on my own. Jonathan's eyes darted around, searching for something, anything to hold on to, but it was too late. He had underestimated me for the last time. The games he had played, the control he had tried to impose on me were all coming to an end.
"You'll never win this, Mom," Jonathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. His confidence was crumbling piece by piece. "Candace is right. You can't take everything away from us. It's too late for that." "I'm not taking anything from you, Jonathan," I said, my voice unwavering. "I'm reclaiming what's mine. You don't have the right to take away my home or my dignity. What you've done to me for all these years, pretending to care while slowly pushing me out of the family, it's over."
Candace stood up abruptly, slamming her hand against the table, her face twisted with rage. "You think you can just walk away with everything? You think you can erase us from your life and take everything Harold worked for? No one's going to let you get away with this." I stood up too, meeting her glare with equal intensity. "I'm not walking away, Candace. I'm standing right here. I'm not the one who's been erasing anyone. You and Jonathan have spent the last few years trying to erase me, trying to push me into a corner and take what I built, but no more." There was a long, tense silence. The kind of silence that can only come when the truth is laid bare. Candace's lips were pressed into a tight line, her fingers curled into fists at her sides. Jonathan, on the other hand, seemed to shrink into himself, his posture more defeated than I had ever seen. "You really think you can do this to us, Mom?" Jonathan asked, his voice cracking. "We're family. We've always been family." I looked at him, my heart heavy with the weight of his words, but I refused to let that pull me back into the web of lies they had spun. "Family," I said softly. "Real family doesn't tear each other down. Real family doesn't take from one another. What you've done to me, what you've done to Harold's legacy, it's unforgivable. But I'm done being a victim." I walked toward the door, turning the handle with a steady hand. "I'm done with the lies, done with the manipulation. I've fought long enough to get where I am, and now I will defend what's mine. You don't get to decide my fate anymore." Jonathan and Candace didn't move. Their silence hung in the air like an oppressive fog. It was over. The power had shifted, and for the first time in a long while, I felt in control. As I closed the door behind them, I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment sink in. This wasn't just about the house or the business or the money. This was about reclaiming my voice, my power, and my place in the world. The next few days were a blur. The legal steps had already been set in motion, and I knew there was no turning back now. I had the support of Margaret the lawyer and Tom, who had always been a loyal ally, and together we would make sure that everything was done by the book. But there was something else at play here. Something deeper than finances. I had learned how to stand up for myself in ways I never thought possible. I had learned to confront my fears head on and to demand the respect I deserved, even from my own son. And for the first time, I knew that I had done the right thing. A few weeks later, I received a call from Tom Bradley, the manager of the business Harold had worked so hard to build. He sounded relieved when he told me that the business was thriving under its new structure with steady contracts and good clients. "Everything's running smoothly, Mrs. Henderson. No one's pushing us around anymore." "Good," I replied, my voice steady. "I'm glad to hear it, but make sure to keep everything transparent. I want to ensure that what's mine remains protected." And just like that, I realized that the life I had once dreamed of was no longer a distant fantasy. It was a reality I was building for myself piece by piece, day by day. The days that followed the confrontation with Jonathan and Candace were a whirlwind of meetings, paperwork, and long conversations with my lawyer, James Patterson. The reality of my situation was setting in. As much as I'd been forced to confront betrayal and loss, I also saw an unexpected glimmer of freedom. Every step forward felt like reclaiming a small part of myself that I had long given up in the name of family. The business was safe under Tom's management. He'd proven to be loyal, and now that the legal documents were all in place, I had the assurance that my future was secure. What had once seemed like a distant, unreachable dream was now within my grasp. But it wasn't just about the money or the assets. It was about the respect that I had fought for so long. I had never imagined that one day the very house that had felt like my sanctuary would become the symbol of my strength. But now, as I stood in the living room looking around at the walls that had witnessed years of family gatherings, I saw the house in a new light. It was mine. Not because of the deed, not because of the bank accounts, but because it represented my victory over everything I had been taught to accept. My cell phone buzzed, and I looked down to see a message from James Patterson. The final hearing is scheduled for next week. We'll be finalizing everything then. It looks like the court will rule in your favor and we'll be moving forward with the transfer. A wave of relief washed over me. The legal battle was almost over. But now there was another part of me that needed to be settled, the emotional side. The side that wasn't so easily fixed with contracts and signatures. That afternoon, I took a drive. It had become one of my favorite things to do since moving to the cottage by the ocean. The drive was short, but scenic, winding through the hills of Mendocino. As I turned onto the familiar stretch of road that led to the coast, I thought about how much had changed in the last few months. A few months ago, I had been trapped in my own home, suffocated by my son's demands and my daughter-in-law's cruelty. Now I had the freedom to make decisions that affected only me. It was overwhelming, but in the best way possible. I pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe and took a seat by the window, letting the soft sound of the waves crash against the rocks soothe my nerves. As I sipped my coffee, I felt a growing sense of peace. For the first time in years, I was at ease. I could feel the weight of the past few weeks lifting off me with every passing moment. The grief for Harold was still there, like an ache that never quite went away. But it was no longer all-consuming. I had learned to stand on my own, to trust my instincts, and to believe that I could take control of my life, even when it seemed like it had been stolen from me. The next day, Tom Bradley called. "Myrtle, I need to talk to you about something," he said, his tone a little more serious than usual. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my mind instantly going to the business. "Everything's fine with the business. It's just that I heard something from one of the contractors yesterday. It seems your son has been making some calls about taking over again. He's still trying to get his hands on the business, even after everything that's been settled." I felt a tightness in my chest. I knew Jonathan was persistent, but this, after everything, he was still trying to manipulate his way into the business. "What's he trying to do now?" I asked, my voice steely. "Well, it seems he's trying to convince some of the suppliers and contractors that the business is better off under his control," Tom said. "But don't worry, I've made it clear to them that you're the one in charge now, and they're all on board." "Good," I replied, though there was a small part of me that felt the sting of betrayal all over again. "Make sure that everything stays in place. I don't want anyone thinking that this is up for negotiation." "I'll take care of it, Myrtle. You don't have to worry about a thing." As I hung up the phone, I felt a simmering anger rise within me. Jonathan had crossed the line one too many times. He thought I was just an old woman, someone to push around when he didn't get his way. But now he was learning that I wasn't going to let him do that anymore. It wasn't just about the house or the business. It was about respect. It was about finally standing up for myself after decades of letting others walk all over me. That evening after dinner, I sat in the living room of my new home, watching the ocean as the sun set. The view from my window was stunning, the horizon stretching out in front of me, endless and beautiful. It was a place of peace, a place I had fought for, and now it was mine. I thought back to the days when I had been afraid of standing up to Jonathan. I thought about the fear that had once paralyzed me. But that fear was gone now. It had been replaced with strength. The doorbell rang and I stood up to answer it, my heart still racing with the anticipation of what was to come. "Hi, Mrs. Henderson," came Tom's voice from the other side of the door. "I just wanted to stop by and check on you, make sure everything's going well with the transition." "Everything's going great, Tom," I replied, smiling. "Thank you for checking in. I really appreciate it." "I'm glad to hear that. Just wanted to remind you that if you need anything, I'm here for you. We've got your back, always." His words warmed me. I realized that for the first time in a long while, I wasn't alone. And I never would be again. As we talked, I realized something else. Everything I had feared, losing my house, my dignity, my place in the world, was no longer my reality. What had once been a nightmare was now a life of my own making. And I was determined to hold on to it no matter what. As the weeks passed, life in my new home began to settle into a new rhythm. I'd found a certain kind of peace in the simplicity of my daily routine. The morning coffee on the porch, watching the sunrise over the water, the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore. It felt like everything I had ever wanted, and it was mine, free from interference or obligation. But there were still days when my thoughts drifted back to Jonathan and Candace, to the way they had treated me when they thought they had won. Even though I was legally in control of everything, there was a sense of lingering resentment that gnawed at me. It wasn't just the betrayal, but the way they had assumed they could take everything from me without a second thought. But then there were other days when I thought about Harold. I could almost hear his voice in the back of my mind, steady and calm, telling me that I was stronger than I knew. I had never realized how much he had protected me, not just through his love, but through every decision he made for our family's future. Every act of kindness, every quiet gesture, every time he took care of something, so I didn't have to worry about it. It was all coming together now in ways I couldn't have understood until he was gone. I had never expected that my independence would come so late in life. But when it came, it arrived with a sense of finality, like a door closing behind me with a soft but unmistakable click. There would be no going back. One afternoon, as I was sitting at the kitchen table, a car pulled into the driveway. I stood up instinctively, walking to the window, half expecting to see Jonathan's car, or perhaps Candace arriving to demand something else from me. But the vehicle that parked in front of my house was unfamiliar, a nondescript sedan with a dull paint job. I frowned, feeling a flutter of unease. I had no reason to be nervous. The house was mine, the business was mine, and I had everything I needed. But a part of me still feared what was coming next. After everything I had gone through, the idea that someone, especially from my family, might still try to take what was rightfully mine felt like a distant threat that I couldn't shake. I opened the door, and before I could say anything, a voice called out, "Mrs. Henderson." I turned to see a tall, middle-aged woman with short, dark hair standing on the porch. She was holding a clipboard and had the look of someone who worked in business, someone who meant business. "Yes," I replied, keeping my tone neutral but polite. "I'm Linda Morrison," she said, extending a hand. "I work with Margaret. You spoke to her about the possibility of speaking at the support group for women who faced financial manipulation. I just wanted to follow up and see if you'd be willing to meet in person to discuss the details." I relaxed my shoulders, loosening slightly. "Of course, Linda," I said, stepping aside to let her in. "Please come in. Would you like some coffee?" We settled into the kitchen, and I could feel a sense of purpose returning to my every movement. I was no longer the woman who had been pushed around, the woman who had allowed herself to be taken advantage of. I was Myrtle Henderson, and I was in control. Linda looked around the room as if taking it all in and smiled. "I have to say, this place is beautiful. You've really made it your own." "Thank you," I replied, a little smile tugging at my lips. "I've had some time to adjust." After a few moments of small talk, we got down to business. Linda explained the details of the support group she was forming, a space for women who had been manipulated by family members in matters of money. As she spoke, I felt a deep sense of purpose rise in me. I had gone through so much, and if I could help even one woman navigate the kind of betrayal I had faced, it would all be worth it. I'd be honored to share my story, I said, my voice steady and firm. I don't want anyone to feel like they have to keep quiet or suffer in silence like I did. Financial manipulation isn't just about money, it's about control, about power, about being made to feel small when you've given everything. And I'm here to tell them that it doesn't have to be that way. Linda's eyes brightened as she nodded, clearly impressed with my words. "That's exactly what I was hoping for. You're an inspiration, Myrtle. I think your story will make all the difference." The meeting ended with the plans for my participation in the group solidified. As Linda left, I felt a strange sense of peace. I was ready to do this, ready to step forward and share my journey with others. It wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about teaching other women to protect themselves, to stand up for what they deserved. But as Linda's car disappeared down the drive, my thoughts inevitably returned to Jonathan and Candace. I couldn't just forget how they had treated me, how they had believed they could simply take everything, assuming that I was too weak to fight back. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood on my porch, looking out at the ocean. The waves crashed against the rocks, relentless and powerful. And I realized that in many ways, I was like the ocean, persistent, unstoppable, and always moving forward. The phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out to see a text from my lawyer, James Patterson. "The final hearing is scheduled for next week. Everything is in place. We're going to wrap this up." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The legal process was almost finished. The settlement was close. And Jonathan and Candace could try all they wanted, they would never get their hands on what was mine. As I watched the last of the light fade from the sky, I whispered to myself, "This is my life now, and I'm never going back." The weeks that followed felt like a blur, a whirlwind of paperwork, meetings, and the occasional phone call with Linda or Margaret as I prepared for my speaking engagement. Despite everything I'd been through, the finality of it all seemed to be hanging just out of reach. The house was mine, the business was mine, and my financial future was secured. Yet there was still one lingering question. What would I do with Jonathan and Candace? Could I ever forgive them? Would I ever let them back into my life? Each morning I woke up to the same quiet comfort. The smell of fresh coffee filled the cottage, and I spent hours on the porch staring out at the vast ocean. It felt so different from the chaos I'd left behind in the city. There was no yelling, no power struggles, no deceit, just peace. And yet there was still something I couldn't shake off. The phone rang one afternoon, breaking me from my thoughts. I saw that it was James Patterson, my lawyer. He had been representing me since the beginning, and his calm presence had been a rock during the chaos. "Hello, Mrs. Henderson," James said, his voice steady. "I just wanted to update you on the final hearing next week. We're in the home stretch. Everything is on track." I felt my stomach flip at the mention of the hearing. The moment that would finally end this battle. The moment I could stop looking over my shoulder. "Thank you, James." "I appreciate all of your hard work," I replied, my voice calm but my mind racing with questions. "Is there anything else I should know? Any last-minute details?" James paused, then spoke slowly. "Actually, yes. Jonathan and Candace are planning one final attempt to contest the trust. They're claiming that they should have been entitled to a larger portion of the business, arguing that it was part of their inheritance by default.
I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. Of course they are. I muttered, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. They never give up, do they? No, James replied, his voice filled with a sense of finality. But this is different. I've reviewed the documents, and their case is weak at best. Their argument doesn't hold up legally. You have nothing to worry about.
I sighed, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. Thank you, James. I've been waiting for this moment for so long. Just a few more days, he said. I'll see you at the hearing next week. We'll wrap this up for good. The call ended, and I sat there for a long while, the quiet hum of the ocean in the background. Part of me wanted to be angry. After all, Jonathan and Candace had taken advantage of me, trying to strip away everything I had worked so hard for. But the anger was fading. It was being replaced by something else. A quiet sense of strength, a feeling that I was finally in control of my own destiny. Later that week, I met with Linda again to finalize the details of my speech. The support group for women who had faced financial manipulation was coming together nicely, and I was eager to share my story. As I prepared for that, I realized that this was my way of turning my pain into something positive. I wasn't just reclaiming my life, I was helping others do the same. I think this will really make a difference, Linda said, her voice full of optimism. Your story is powerful. You've been through so much, and now you're standing on your own, stronger than ever. I nodded, feeling the truth of her words in my bones. I was stronger now, not because I had wealth or security, but because I had reclaimed my dignity and independence. And that was worth more than anything. The final hearing day arrived faster than I expected. The morning was crisp, and the sky was clear as I drove into the city, feeling a sense of determination settle in my chest. This was it, the moment when everything would finally be settled, when I could officially close the door on the chapter of my life that had been consumed by betrayal. James met me outside the courthouse, his usual calm demeanor reassuring. "You're ready," he said, as we walked inside. "We have the evidence, we have the facts, and we have the law on our side." When we entered the courtroom, I saw Jonathan and Candace sitting across the room. Their faces were as cold as ever, but there was an underlying tension in the air. They were about to lose, and they knew it. The hearing began, and I sat in silence, listening to the arguments being made. James presented the evidence, documents, contracts, financial statements, everything proving that the trust was solid and legally binding. Jonathan's lawyer tried to argue that they were entitled to more, but the facts didn't support their claims. It didn't take long for the judge to make his decision. "The trust is valid," he declared. "Jonathan and Candace are not entitled to any portion of Henderson Construction or the estate. All assets will remain with the beneficiary, Mrs. Henderson." I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was quickly replaced by something deeper. I wasn't just relieved that I had won. I was empowered. The last of the control they thought they had over me had slipped away, and now I could breathe freely. The legal battle was over, and I could finally move on with my life. Jonathan and Candace may have lost this fight, but I knew that I had won something far more valuable, my peace. As we left the courthouse, James turned to me. "You did it, Myrtle. It's over." I smiled, feeling the weight of everything that had happened lift off my shoulders. "Yes, it is," I said softly. "And now, I'm free." It had been 6 months since that day in court. The dust had finally settled, and I could feel the weight of the years of struggle lifting from my shoulders. The house, once filled with the echoes of deceit and manipulation, now stood as a symbol of my resilience. The oceanfront cottage that had become my sanctuary was now my true home, where I had built a life free from the shadows of the past. I spent my days in the garden, nurturing the flowers and vegetables that now grew abundantly in the rich soil. I had always loved gardening, but it had been something I had put off in my busy, complicated life. Now, with the time and space to tend to it, I found that it brought me a sense of peace that I had longed for. In the afternoons, I would take long walks along the shore, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. The salty air filled my lungs, and for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. I was no longer defined by the expectations of others or the role that had been forced upon me. I was free. As for Jonathan and Candace, they had tried to fight the settlement in the beginning, but as the months passed, their resolve weakened. They had no choice but to accept the terms and move on with their lives. I never heard from them again, and honestly, I didn't care. The relationship I had once cherished had crumbled beyond repair, and I had no intention of rebuilding it. My family, as it had been, no longer existed. Instead, I focused on the new connections I was building. Linda had invited me to several gatherings with other women who had faced financial manipulation or familial betrayal. Their stories resonated deeply with me, and I found solace in sharing my own. I had become a mentor of sorts to others, offering guidance and support as they navigated the challenges of reclaiming their independence. In one of our meetings, Linda approached me with an idea. "Myrtle, I've been thinking. You've got such a powerful story and you've helped so many women. Have you ever thought about writing a book? I think it could make a real difference." The thought had never occurred to me, but as Linda spoke, I felt a spark of inspiration. Writing a book would be my way of leaving a legacy of sharing my journey and the lessons I had learned along the way. It was a daunting task, but I knew I had the strength to do it. After all, I had survived everything life had thrown at me so far. The first draft of the book was slow to come. I would sit at my desk each morning typing out my thoughts as they came to me. The process was cathartic, allowing me to relive the painful moments and turn them into something meaningful. But it was also empowering. Every word I typed was a reminder that I had taken control of my life and that I had built something entirely new from the ashes of my past. As I wrote, I began to reflect on the person I had been before everything fell apart. I had been so focused on pleasing others, on maintaining the facade of a perfect family. I had let Jonathan and Candace manipulate me for so long that I had forgotten who I truly was. But now I was reclaiming my own identity. I was no longer the dutiful wife, the quiet mother, or the woman who had been pushed aside. I was Myrtle, and I was in control of my destiny. I spent the next year writing, editing, and revising the manuscript. It was exhausting, but it was also the most rewarding thing I had ever done. When the book was finally finished, I felt a sense of accomplishment that I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just a book, it was my story, my triumph over adversity. Linda helped me find a publisher, and soon enough, I was holding the first copy of my book in my hands. It was surreal, and for a moment I just sat there, staring at the cover, my name emblazoned in bold letters. I had done it. I had turned my pain into something powerful, something that could help others. The book was released to positive reviews, and I was invited to speak at conferences and workshops. I found myself standing on stages, sharing my journey with others who needed to hear it. I had become a voice for those who had been silenced, a beacon of hope for those who thought they would never break free from the chains of their past. But the most important change came from within. I had learned to forgive not just Jonathan and Candace, but myself. I had spent so many years feeling guilty for things that were beyond my control. I had blamed myself for the collapse of my family, for not seeing the signs of manipulation earlier. But I now understood that I had done the best I could with the tools I had at the time. I wasn't perfect, but I was enough. As I stood on the deck of my cottage one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues, I realized just how far I had come. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every difficult step. I had found my way back to myself, and in the process, I had created a life that was truly my own. I was no longer the woman who had been pushed around by life's circumstances. I was a survivor, a fighter, and now I was thriving. The phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out to see a text from Linda. "How's the book tour going?" "I'm so proud of you." I smiled to myself, my heart swelling with pride. "It's going great, Linda. Thank you for everything." As I put the phone away and gazed out at the horizon, I knew that no matter what came next, I was ready. I had faced the worst, and I had come out stronger. My future was mine to shape, and I had no intention of letting anyone take that away from me. The waves crashed against the rocks below, and the sound was a reminder of the endless possibilities that lay ahead. I was free, and I was at peace.